In this session, Mrs. Graça MACHEL will discuss the special role of developing nations in global education, the unique issues in their education systems, and the solutions aimed at resolving them. Before we invite her up, let's take a look at a short video. Please welcome our speaker, Mrs. Graça MACHEL, child rights advocate and humanitarian.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Princess Laureates had time to rewrite her speech during the night. I didn't. And the conversations this morning left me really feeling very inadequate in the kind of reflections I want to share with you. But I have mostly to thank Charles, Yidan, and Clive for having invited me to participate and to have the opportunity to address such a distinguished audience today. I was blown out last night with the presentation of the Laureates of 2018, and I continue to be blown out this morning with Princess Laureates, and exactly for the kind of presentation we had here with the former astronaut. And it keeps me thinking where the children and the youth of our developing countries stand in all these extraordinary developments which we have been learning about during these 2 days. I was asked to speak this morning on education in developing countries. Of course, you are aware that it's a huge, because there's so much to be said about this topic, and the developing world itself, it's so vast and so diverse. And I'm afraid not only I have to be brief, but also I will be relatively vague. By virtue of demographics, developing countries are home to massive numbers of young people who will make up the majority of the world's workforce in 21st century. And given the magnitude of this opportunity, and many would think it is a challenge, I suggest we think and we take responsibility in terms of how do we prevent that if the developing world continue in a pace which is not matching the developed world, we can, as a human race, be leading to a situation of a huge inequality and huge social injustice. So I suggest we think of education as an investment with long-term perspective, whose returns will go beyond the benchmarks we establish of 2030, for instance, but we look at the returns of how we are going to have as outcomes healthy and robust societies, highly productive, flexible workforces, and well-developed human capital. So for this, my suggestion is to look at first, how do we lay solid foundations? And I would like to challenge the conventional approach today, where we look at education, particularly from the primary school. And I urge us to think about beginning investing in a child's education right from the moment of conception. Studies have shown that proper nutrition received from the first 1,000 days is monumentally transformative to developing a child's full potential. Let me give an example of a tree. When we plant a tree, we begin by preparing the soil. And we put all the nutrients we believe are important to make this tree grow strong and to be able to provide the right fruits in the future. A tree, of course, doesn't grow only in 10 years. It can be 20, it can be 30. But what this tree is going to become, it depends on how the soil was prepared when you plant, and it depends on how, of course, you continue to care for this tree along decades. What we have been doing in many cases in developing countries is that we look at a child when he or she is 6 to 7. And then we pour water, we put fertilizer, while we didn't really do the right thing at the beginning in terms of the investment, which in many cases, if you use the example of tree, you don't see. The roots are not seen, but they are the desire to continue to feed the tree for long life perspective. In Asia and Africa in particular, the contribution to nutrition, to human capital development, and ensuring sustained economic growth is incredibly important, yet often underestimated. Studies have shown that perhaps the single most pressing challenge for children in Asia and Africa is undernutrition, as more than 3/4 of the world's 151 million stunted children under 5 live in South Asia and Africa. And 70% of all malnourished children in the world are living right here in Asia. Latin America is not immune to the challenge of providing its youngest generation a healthy start in life, as nearly 70% of countries in the region are grappling with malnutrition as well. Prevalence of stunting is over twice as high for indigenous children under 5 as for the non-indigenous children, ranging from 22 in Colombia and 58 in Guatemala. The lasting effects on the cognitive and the physical development of children in developing world and their families has led somehow to what I could call stunted development of societies. The challenge of undernourishment has continued to persist as many governments across the developing world at least do not adequately prioritize spending on nutrition despite evidence of its importance to individuals, to households, and to national economy. And I think this is where change has to start. The benefits of investing in nutrition during the first 1,000 days are overwhelmingly abundant. From a health and development perspective, it builds a child's brain and fuels their growth. It improves a child's school readiness and educational achievements. And ultimately, it reduces disparities in health, education, and earning potential. A lack of investment in nutrition comes to a huge cost to us globally. And African nations, for example, lose between 1.2, which is 2%, and 16% of GDP annually to undernutrition due to increased mortality, absenteeism, chronic illness, and the loss of productivity. Clearly, there are few better investments we can make to ensure children reap the benefits of education provided to them and break cycles of poverty in developing countries. And given that I am a women's rights activist, permit me to emphasize that it is particularly strategic that girl children in developing world are adequately nourished, educated, and valued. It is no secret that in order for a society to advance, it must harness the potential of all its citizens, and therefore, investment in education of the girl child is central to vibrant, equitable societies where social justice reigns. Following a long and continued of investment, nutrition received during the first 1,000 days of life needs to be supplemented with an investment in early child development. African countries, on average, devote just 2% of education budgets to pre-primary education and early child development programs. This small percentage is committed in the face of overwhelming World Bank evidence, which proves that an additional dollar invested in quality early childhood program yields a return of between $6 and $17. Countries across the developing world have been making significant investment in education. However, the results are not matching the outlay. Children are completing primary and secondary education without the basic knowledge and skills required. We are disadvantaging our children and entire societies by denying a student a proper quality education. Studies from UNICEF that show that there would be a 13-fold increase in GDP over the lifetime of all children born today in lower middle income countries if they were educated to a basic level of literacy and numeracy. The international community at the 2015 AIDS conference in Addis conference in financing education clearly adopted as a goal the, I quote, inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all children. I welcome the Education Commission's investment plan, which will be presented later by my friend Gordon Brown, which calls for low and middle income countries to increase domestic public expenditure on education from an estimate of 1 trillion in 2015 to 2.7 trillion by 2030, or from 4 to 5.8% of GDP. It is impossible for the development world to reach human development indicators the rest of the developed world enjoys when it is actively forfeiting the talent and the potential of its youngest generation. Data coming out of Latin America is disturbing. With 92% of children beginning primary school, but only 41% of Brazilians and 35% of Mexicans' children graduating from secondary school, which means there is, in some cases, about 60% of loss and 35% of loss before the secondary. Even more shocking, statistics from African Union show that out of the 17% of girls starting primary school, only 8% finish secondary school. Clearly, these systems are leaking, and they are leaking very heavily. Girls in particular are being denied access to education through discrimination, violence in schools, poverty, high rates of teenage pregnancies, and harmful traditional practices such as child marriage. I'd like to focus on child marriage for a minute, as it is such a devastating impediment to girls' education in developing countries. In fact, for the three regions, Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, it is a common feature. So from Cartagena to Cairo to Calcutta, girls are victims to child marriage where they are often perceived as an economic burden. And many parents marry off the children in the hope of improving their economic and financial security. The numbers are heartbreaking. Nearly one in four girls across Latin America are married before the age of 18. African nations account from 17 out of 20 countries with the highest rates of child marriage globally. Southeast Asia, girls are married off at alarming rates as well. India, for example, is ranking 10 in the world of child marriage, with an estimate of 47 girls married by the time they turn 18. The damage this type of disenfranchisement has on the developing world is mind-blowing and unacceptable. We are well advised, as those dedicated to improving education around the world, to support, implement interventions aimed at ending child marriage as an integral part of our work. And how can we try to deal with this? One of the ways is improving retention and performance of the education system, because there are challenges that countries across the developing world experience. And if we are serious about improving education outcomes, we must focus on keeping children, particularly girls, in school until at least the completion of a secondary education. Education, particularly for girls, is a catalyst for reducing child mortality and maternal deaths, actually. In essence, it breaks the cycle of poverty, because girls are empowered and they can make decisions about their lives and about their future, about the kind of profession they want to pursue, when to marry if they ever want to, how many children they are going to have, and they can have small and healthy families. So educating girls, at least at the age, until the age of 18, has such a transformative effect in the kind of societies we might have, which it requires not only a human rights approach, which is my concern, but eventually we think in terms of economics, we think in terms of the social transformation we want for the 21st century. So, knowing what we know, we must demand that governments fully meet their commitments to the investment in education and work in partnership with the civil society and private sector as well. Because in essence, leaking, I'm talking about, it is a loss of human potential. It is an economic loss. And more importantly, it's a human rights affront. Having talked of the foundations, let's now look a bit about the importance of improving the quality of education to meet the 21st century demands. Surely, we need to combine the long-term perspective, which I talked about, of investing in the foundations, with short and medium-term strategies which are much more flexible. Why? Because our young people cannot wait until the next 20 or 30 years to come. The demand for them to become part of citizens of the 21st century is now. So I must emphasize that quality of education is a sine qua non condition for children and youth to grasp the challenge and, more importantly, the opportunities of 21st century. The Africa Child Policy Forum's report for this year on well-being of the African child cites that 2 in every 5 African children leave primary school without learning how to read, write, or do simple arithmetics. And many teachers fail to reach minimum standards. So such poor quality of education threats the ability to compete in an increasingly technologically driven global economy. In Latin America, 50 years old score especially poorly in maths and science, which are critical skills in today's job market. Recent studies reveal that approximately 50% of Mexicans, Colombians, and Brazilians do not have the skills necessary to solve a simple math equation or to explain basic scientific phenomena. Our societies are changing incredibly quickly. Economic and social transformation require skills and talents which are not being systematically cultivated in the developing world systems. Our curriculum are not keeping pace with the trends and developments of the ever-evolving landscape. So, what do we do? As education enthusiasts, we are all familiar with the 4 C's of 21st century learning. The widely regarded most important skills required in education of this century are critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. So this leads us to education requiring a profound reform so that children are not going to be left behind. one of the most important mantra of sustainable development goals is leave no one behind. And if we don't transform the systems of education, then it means we will leave millions and millions of young people in developing worlds to be left behind. So very quickly, the ability to be tech savvy, to be media literate, to leverage the knowledge and power of the internet are now prerequisites to being able to compete and contribute to the economy of today and tomorrow. So efforts to ensure girls thrive, for instance, in STEM fields, must particularly be enhanced. Developing countries must position themselves to benefit from rapidly accelerating technological changes that can unlock growth and leapfrog the limitations and costs of physical education infrastructure and the traditional learning modalities. We have to get more creative around how we educate and equip our youngest generation today to set them for success. An example, the African Leadership University is an innovative model of higher education that is preparing the African continent's leaders for today and tomorrow. They employ a unique pedagogy incorporating on-the-job training and 4 months learnership during the academic year. In addition to significant workplace exposure, the university offers both online and in-person learning and curricula relevant to the 21st century market to empower young people who will be prominent forces in global and national organizations as well as grassroots. So this innovative kind of approach to tertiary education is something we suggest as a model which can be replicated in many other countries. In short, investment in education is not optional. It is the key to transforming societies and a fundamental driver of economic development, of equity, and of social justice. And it is not the job of government ministries of education and NGOs alone. It is a national imperative and the responsibility of all as we prepare the youngest generation to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We have, in our part of the world, gems of researchers, gems of institutions, gems of innovation. What we are faced with is while we transform radically the systems, we scale up those gems, we scale up and we make them actually the transformative forces which will close the gap between what we are facing as challenges and to take the opportunities which are available elsewhere. And I thank you.